Sometimes, this is a realization, sometimes we say things without realizing how they sound to others. Verbal impact is how I titled this sermonette. And so let's think about the verbal impact of our words. We want to intensify the awareness of verbal impact from our communication. Start out with an early Bible. From the early part of the Bible, by the early part of the Bible, I mean the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So in that part of the Bible, we call the Torah, or the first 5 books, there is a verse of Scripture which doesn't necessarily say what we would think it is, what is really meaning. It says something that's maybe a little bit of a head scratcher. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 14. Now, the Israelites had not long come out of Egypt, and they were in the first year of the 40 years that they were going to spend before they went into the Promised Land. And so the book of Leviticus is written at that point. Later on, in their 40-year period, actually the 40th year, the book of Deuteronomy was written. So we have the first giving of the law, Leviticus, and then at the end of the 5 books, we have Deuteronomy, which was the second giving of the law. But Leviticus 19 and verse 14 says the following: "You shall not curse the deaf." Now, if somebody is deaf, and I know they can't hear me, but anyway, I want to express myself in some angry way against them, it says you are not to do that. That was a law among the Israelites. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind. We have a member who attends here. Marty Turkowitz is his name. And Marty is blind. And we have to help Marty around the room. He pretty well knows his way around, but we move things from time to time. So we try to be particularly helpful to Marty and be sure not only that we're not casting some stumbling block in front of him, but that we are giving him some positive help and being able to get around the room. So you have those 2 categories of people here in the book of Leviticus without much of an explanation, except it says you shall not, curse the deaf or cast a stumbling block in front of the blind, but shall fear your God. That's where this section gets back to God here, this verse of Scripture. You shall fear your God, and then it says, I am the Lord. So that's from the early Bible. But what does that mean? I mean, of course, if we have a blind man, if Enoch is visiting here today, if he was a deaf person, and we were to know that he was deaf and we were to curse him, it would be a violation of this Scripture. But how often does that happen? Is that the reason that this was written? Well, yes, it is, but it's only the beginning part of the reason. But is it really just talking about the physically blind and the physically deaf, or is it talking about a spiritual condition? I would submit to you that this is about a physical spiritual analogy. Because you see, there are those people who are physically blind, and there are those people who are spiritually blind. There are those people who are physically deaf, and there are those people who are spiritually deaf. Most cases, there's a much larger population of the spiritually blind and the spiritually deaf than there are of the physically. And so we are to even be far more concerned with those people who are physically or spiritually blind and deaf than we are with the physically blind and deaf. So we understand that we're not just talking about people who are physically handicapped. We are talking about people who are spiritually blind and deaf. Matthew 13 and verse 13. Here in this verse of the Gospel of Matthew, this chapter, the whole chapter really, of the book of Matthew, Christ is out with people in an outdoor site. He's out on a boat. His disciples are on the boat with him. They're speaking across the water because speaking across the water amplifies the things that they are hearing at the far end. It is a kind of a natural public address system to be speaking across the water, and so they could hear. But his disciples came and said, "Why are you speaking to them?" Because he spoke to them only in parables. That's what it tells us in Matthew chapter 13. He didn't speak to them in a straightforward way at all, and what they heard they didn't understand, and they were really certain that if they didn't understand it, and they spent all of their time pretty much with Christ, how are these people on the shore going to ever understand what Christ was saying? PA system amplification across the water or not, how could they understand what they were hearing? And so they asked Christ, "Why do you always only speak to them in parables?" His answer, Matthew 13:13. "I speak to them in parables because they seeing do not see, and hearing they do not hear, neither do they understand." He is saying, I do not want these people at this point in time to understand. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the sermon before we get through today. But those people were not to understand the things that Christ was saying. And he tells why they weren't ready for it at that time. But the entire chapter of Matthew 13 is a very important chapter in what Christ is doing in his ministry. There's a sequence that I would like to address here. Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1. By a sequence, I mean there's a series of things that happen, one right after the other, and they're not separate incidents, but they're related to each other. Book of Psalms, I think, is divided typically into 7 different books. Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1, it is this is of particular note. It is the very first verse in a very large book of Scripture. There are quite a few, 170, 180 Psalms. And it's introduced with this one verse of Scripture. So think about how important God is saying this verse of Scripture is when he puts it as the first verse in the book of Psalms. Blessed is the man. When we think about that, we all want to be blessed. You know, every one of us who come here want God's blessing. And we look forward to having that. And God is willing, and he has plans to give it to each and every one of not only us, but all of the people that were standing there on the shore listening to Christ, who were having it at that point in their lives withheld from them. God doesn't intend to keep it withheld from them forever. He's going to reveal it. But it says, blessed, that's a really big word for us, is the man that does not walk. That's the first part of the sequence. Does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly. Now, there are lots of people who are counseling us, aren't there, that are ungodly. But that's sort of the first step in here. This is kind of like going down the primrose path or following the way to destruction. The first thing is walking in the counsel of the ungodly. And so the importance of verbal communication is being spread here in this verse of Scripture. And if he doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, second step in the sequence is does not stand in the way of sinners. So walking in the counsel of the ungodly. As you go through life, if you have a relationship with people in whatever field that are ungodly and they would direct you away from the paths of God, you're losing the blessing if you follow that path. Blessed is the man that doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly and does not stand in the way of sinners. So as you walk along, then you stand. That's the second stage, the second part of the sequence. Does not stand in the way of sinners, and then finally becomes so intractable that you sit. You cannot move out of where you're at. And who is it that sits in that way? The scornful. Scornful. So that's the three parts. One, don't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. Nor two, stand in the way of the sinner. And then finally, worst of all, do not sit in the seat of the scornful. And if anything characterizes our society today, it is that we are a scornful people. And we see an awful lot of that. I think about this as I sit here before you today. It's a particular responsibility of mine that I should not be scornful of, because we're quite different. We know that we're quite different. We understand that we are in receipt of a lot of knowledge that other religious groups, whether they be Protestants or Catholics or whatever other church do not have in the same way that we do. So we have to guard against, what I said early in the sermonette, the impact that we have verbally if we are scornful toward other groups. God does not like for us to do that. Rather than being scornful, we should fear the Lord our God. I would say, I've been in the church now for 50 years. We were baptized in 69, Hazel and I. 50 years in the church, and too often I have seen times when and I suppose I've participated in it myself, and I'm trying not to participate in it for some long time now, but once in a while you do something that you don't wish that you did. You may criticize another group, laugh, scorn another group because of what they believe, and we should not be doing that. What we should realize that these are the people that are blind, and these are the people that are deaf, and God says, do not curse the deaf, and do not cast a stumbling block in front of the blind. Have sympathy for them, understand they're going to become properly a part of God's family, the same as you are and as I am. So here's the conclusion. Do not be one who mocks. Do not sit in the seat of the scornful. And let's all renew our effort to be sure that we are aware of the potential impact that our words have.